Welcome to Rome 2 Total War Divide Et Impera episode 9. At the beginning of this episode we saw our war with Athens come to blows, as well as our new borders being tested, and our armed forces overstretched as our economy struggled to support so many active theatres. The Athenian army that raided and sacked Side was still at large, operating in the vicinity of the town. One of our victorious conquering armies in the north of Anatolia was being dispatched south to deal with them. There was also much discussion with what to do with Crimea. They were at war with us, but their lands lay beyond our remit, and we were not interested in opening up another massive front. As matters were being discussed by the council, Athens' army inside, despite destroying the city and the countryside, decided to attack what remained of the inhabitants, slaughtering the badly damaged defensive force and setting up a puppet of their own, the great city of democracy showing their true colours. As if their war crimes were not bad enough at this point, they proceeded to march straight towards Iconium and appeared to repeat their previous sour deeds, sacking the town and remaining on the outskirts. We knew what was going to follow, and so the Imotekiates were deployed from north to the area. Then Crimea, as if they heard us talking about them, came offering peace, a deal we were only too happy to accept. Turning the Black Sea into a raiding basin was not what we had in mind. This would also allow our heir and his army to head south and strengthen our front against the Athenians. The Athenians' puppet, the Pamphylian city-states, came seeking a peace deal. Naturally, it was declined without even a discussion with the council due to the nature of their inception. The Imotekiates then wasted no time and immediately attempted to attack the Athenian menace in our south. The cowards retreated and manoeuvred themselves into a position where their new vassal would be on hand to help them. We now found ourselves fighting our combined enemy forces in not the most ideal of locations, the side of a mountain. The decision was made that we would deploy in a column and march towards the opening in the tree line and attempt to use the high ground to our advantage defensively. We set up our formation and remembered the famous saying, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." Our ballista then began raining their fiery molten balls down upon the enemy and using the hill to our advantage by skimming the shots off of the ground, to great effect, inflicting massive amounts of damage before the enemy even reached the summit. Then the centres of both armies clashed, and both sides' cavalry began the dance on the flanks, looking for weaknesses. The aim was to destroy the Athenians before their vassal reinforcements could arrive. With this in mind, we manoeuvred our light infantry round the flanks while our pikemen held the centre, and began attempting to encircle the Athenians' heavy hoplites. Our Sarissa lancers were able to dispose of the enemy's cavalry, and we held the advantage. Before long, the Athenian army had been surrounded and largely dispatched from the field. The entire time this engagement had been going on, our ballista had been firing at the approaching enemy reinforcements, which meant that they had been slowed on their approach. The vital time that had been brought proved to be pivotal, as it allowed us to reform our lines and quickly rest our men for the second battle which was about to begin. With the enemy skirmishers pelting us from afar, one of our units of lancers volunteered to smash straight through the enemy lines towards the skirmisher blob. They made contact and pinned multiple enemy units, while our lines continued doing work and our cavalry manoeuvred towards the enemy's flanks. It didn't take long for the superiority of our infantry to shine through, and the enemy began routing en masse back towards the settlement of Side. Oh, what a fate awaited them. With Side well and truly back in our hands, all trace of these dissidents was wiped from existence, and it was decided by the council that revenge was the number one priority in the west. Then, the devastating news that no one expected came to light. Antiochus I, our original king who had brought us from a poor, obscure, fractured kingdom to a great power, had died of old age. It's likely no one expected the warrior king to go in such a way. The feats he had achieved against the Egyptians, the Nabateans, and more recently Pergamon would never be forgotten. He had chose his successor and adopted his great nephew Antiochus II, who had already proven himself a capable governor and commander as well as warrior, having fought beside his father in multiple campaigns in the north. With fresh leadership came fresh perspective. That perspective was largely unchanged from his father. The Seleucids were Alexander's true heir, and the Greek people would be united once again. The time to mourn had to be put on hold, as we were still embroiled in multiple wars and ongoing assaults. The siege of Tushpa turned into a field battle as our enemy sallied out of the settlement and engaged us in an open field. Normally we would toast to this, however, in this instance, the enemy brought heavy cataphracts against us, which our cavalry were no real challenge for. We decided to deploy in a forest area of the map and use the trees and thick foliage as a deterrent for the enemy cavalry, as well as deploying our pikes in a half crescent formation in the hope of making ourselves more difficult to flank. These decisions seemed to work, as for some time the enemy's heavy cavalry maintained their distance, with only their infantry engaging our centre. This was until the enemy commander decided to frontally charge all of his cataphracts straight into our pike wall, a disastrous decision on his part, but a great one for us. Our peltasts began moving around the enemy's flanks while our companion cavalry attempted to engage the enemy's cavalry in melee. Cataphracts were known for the heavy charge and armour, not their prolonged melee capabilities. With their catalyst taken out of the fight, we slowly began folding the enemy's lines into a centre point where their numbers advantage could not be brought to bear upon us. From this point onward, victory was assured. The only concern was how heavy would our casualties be. With the victory, Tushpa was now captured. The enemy blemish that had been in the centre of our kingdom was no more. We had completely consolidated our landmass and now only had to look externally. It didn't take long for the next threat to manifest itself and appear on the horizon. Athens sent a fresh army across the Bosphorus, and we sallied our forces from our freshly conquered territories across Anatolia to meet the threat. Our enemy had encamped in a fortress and probably assumed they were safe. Our ballista disagreed. We turned their defensive works into a coffin, and our entire line advanced towards the fort while our ballista hammered the fort from range. Because of the enemy's scramble out of the fort, in sheer desperation, we managed to concentrate fire upon the bottleneck. Hundreds of the enemy's warriors had fallen before even laying eyes upon us. The forces that managed to break out scrambled towards our lines, and our cavalry hit any of the enemy's outlying forces when left isolated. The infantry lines then clashed. The enemy had lost so many men to the barrage that they struggled to meet our depth. This slow attrition had taken its toll. Before long, we had them completely surrounded and began killing unit by unit with clinical precision until only a few survivors were left standing, likely fleeing towards Athens to report our victory and our imminent crossing of the Bosphorus. Some wanted to piece some of our enemies so we could lick our wounds and recover. Some wanted to press our advantage. One thing was certain, Antiochus II had Athens on his mind. The decision was cast: we would declare war on Apsinthoi for the sole reason that they were Greek and lay in our way. We sieged the city and were pleasantly surprised when one of our satrapy's armies appeared on the horizon to assist with the siege. As we approached the town, we realised that Parthiva were sending their forces, which were entirely cavalry, directly into the town. Our infantry were surprised to see thousands of cataphracts and horse archers charge straight into the town without truly knowing what awaited them. We left the enemy to the main fight, assisting with some skirmishing and ballista fire, while our cavalry attacked the enemy's flanking forces. We hoped to buy our ally time in their attempts to shock and awe the town. We swiftly defeated these forces and began flanking through the side streets of the town, encircling the enemy's forces in the town square. Our royal peltasts threw devastating volleys of javelins into the tightly packed enemy ranks before charging into the mangled mess. From their initial charge, the enemy were beginning to flee, and cries were immediately let out as if we had achieved victory. Alas, the drums and instruments were heard in the distance. Yet another enemy army approached the town from the northwest. The siegers were about to become the besieged. We moved our men into a defensive position, allowing our satrapy to defend the inner works of the town, while we defended the flank. Our enemy began engaging us, but the second our elephants charged them, and they realised we were already in possession of the town, they fled towards the countryside. Our foothold across the Bosphorus was secured. With its success, our second army moved into the theatre, and we transitioned from defender to attacker in the Great Greek War. With festivities kicking off in the north, our army that had been dispatched towards Mascat found itself having to relocate and land in one of our ports north of Mascat, continuing the rest of the route on foot while the navy shadowed the army from the sea. It didn't take long for these forces to be spotted in their fort. Mascat launched an attack towards us, mustering what appeared to be every able-bodied warrior, scrambled into two separate armies which were attacking us from two sides in an attempt to cut off our retreat. Our warriors here were no fresh recruits. This was the Bloodied Band, veterans of more battles and sieges than I have time to list. This would likely just be another accolade to add to their standard. With the enemy approaching from two sides, our defence was scrambled and organised at the last minute. Pikes would attempt to hold the entrances to the fort, while our infantry and cavalry waited for the perfect moment to flank. The enemy charged their camel warriors straight at the fort, likely hoping to catch us off guard. However, the grizzled veterans held firm, while our towers and archers alike rained in fiery death from above. Before long, the entirety of the enemy's first army was upon that side of the fort, and a melee broke out with our pikes planting their flag and defending the choke. The enemy's second army was then spotted on their approach. Our infantry was scrambled outside the walls, and the hope was that we could set a strong defensive line with access available for our cavalry to get out and make manoeuvres. While the initial engagement was raging on, part of our defensive wall caught alight, and we realised it was only a matter of time until it collapsed. We slowly retreated our pikes a few steps to allow the wall room to settle. Luckily for us, it collapsed outward upon the enemy's mass of men. With this larger front line now open, we sent in our Ethiopian axemen who rampaged through the enemy's scattered front line, causing absolute havoc. These ferocious warriors' charge, coupled with a cavalry encirclement, began the enemy's chain route back into the desert. Meanwhile, the second army was locked in a melee at the other side of the fort. Manoeuvring of our light infantry, coupled with expert cavalry command of our elephants, began the rout of their second army. Their attempts to ambush us and cut off our retreat in the desert had been futile, and had actually accelerated their demise, allowing us to take Muscat, finally completing our conquest of the Arabian Peninsula. Again, as always seemed to be the case, a great victory was achieved. However, something happened elsewhere in our kingdom that led us to a delay in the festivities. Our armies in the north had finally managed to corner the remnants of Pergamon and Odessos. Our great enemy's fight for survival had begun. The composition of the enemy's forces was certainly not something we were used to coming up against. They had a strong defensive garrison, with multiple naval forces coming in throughout the duration to reinforce. We noted that these naval forces were the guilty parties in many of the coastal raids on the northern coast of Anatolia. Vengeance was fresh on our mind. Our ballistas immediately began hammering the town as we moved up our pikemen, supported by our skirmishers. The plan was to keep the town occupied while we dealt with the enemy's reinforcements that would likely be landing in waves. The first landing attempt was successfully thwarted by the combined efforts of our royal peltas, who threw every projectile they had at the enemy's general unit, and our cavalry that ran through the enemy's skirmishers as they began to land. With the first wave successfully destroyed, we manoeuvred the main body of our army around the gateway to the town, attempting to get a better angle for our ballistas. Our ranged units continued pelting the enemy with all forms of projectile, and to our surprise the enemy simply held position. The second wave of the enemy's naval landings then came ashore, and we repeated more or less exactly what we achieved on the first wave. Our cavalry were now entirely focused on the landing parties, and they didn't stand a chance. With the enemy's reinforcements being shattered, their hope must have began wavering. It was at this point we finally committed our infantry to an assault on the town, while our archers fired the last of their fire arrows into the enemy's blob. Their morale then disintegrated, and before we knew it, we had the town. With this final conquest, we brought our war with one of our biggest adversaries, Pergamon, to an end. With our two armies now poised to invade the heart of Greece, we began the siege of Pulpadeva. We had encircled the town for 6 months, and it was decided the time to attack was now. We had our ballistas fire at one section of the wall, while our giant wall ram smashed into another section. This was a brand new siege technology that we had not yet used, and were very impressed with the results. We managed to smash 2 holes simultaneously in the enemy's walls, and we flooded the right gap with our cavalry, and aimed to get into the heart of the town so they could run riot around the enemy's flank. At the left hole, we threw in some peltas supported by some light infantry. These men successfully surprised the enemy and threw projectiles at their flank before charging them and catching them off guard. Our cavalry then had their moment when they managed to rear-charge multiple units of enemy infantry in the streets as they attempted to scramble their way towards the walls. Before long, we had the final remnants of the enemy's defensive forces trapped on and around a section of the wall. We swiftly surrounded them on all sides and began slaughtering them to a man. This victory was massive for us, as we now had the defensive bastion in the heart of Greece that could be used as a staging ground. As we toasted another success, we were greeted with some diplomacy. In what appeared to be a desperate attempt to unite the free Greeks against us, Athens appeared to pressure Rhodes into declaring war on us indirectly by attacking our satrapy Sardes. At this point of the war, we would of course come to our satrapy's defence. The discussion was then floated to the council regarding our current ruling hierarchy. We were currently set up as a kingdom, but was the time upon us to switch to an empire? We certainly had the required landmass. At this point as well, I just want to say a quick thank you to Kyle from the past for the following end stream recap. As of the end of the stream, we now control the same lands we had in the north, Egyptus, Ethiopia. We now have the Horn of Africa. We have the entirety of Arabia. The entirety of the Arabian Peninsula is ours. We stretch from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, pretty much unmolested. Anything in between is our allies, our satrapies. We do now have, I would say we have a few satrapies now showing cracks, maybe not too interested in hanging around. Parthiva and Parthia have shown a little bit of cracks. We've just declared war on Saka, trying to bring them in. We have Agrisi here in the north as our satrapy bordering Crimea, who we have a sort of tentative peace with just now. Over here, we've made serious gains in Thrace. We've taken the two coastal settlements as well as Pulpadeva, and we have our two full armies, one garrisoned in Pulpadeva, the other is to the south watching the crossroads, and we have a third army en route. We have pretty much learned that we're going to have to build a navy, which is what we're currently doing in Alexandria, and they're going to move up and hopefully help us take Rhodes, Crete, and then eventually get onto mainland Greece, which will see us end our campaign as we reclaim Alexander's empire. Thank you for watching episode 9. We are reaching the end game here, and I look forward to both streaming this and creating this recap every single week. We will be live once again at 2000 BST on the 26th of July, when it looks likely that the invasion of Macedonia and Hellas will come to a head. There's not much more to say other than, as always, thank you for being a viewer, and we will catch you on the next one.